Interstellar Trade Council Ruling 4471C, formally adopted by unanimous vote of all 31 member delegations, reads, in its entirety, as follows. Human delegates are henceforth prohibited from participating in any card game involving wagered stakes during official or unofficial council functions, effective immediately and indefinitely. The following account, compiled from council session transcripts, delegate testimony, and the personal recollection of Junior Attaché Jake Sutter, explains exactly how a friendly Tuesday night card game very nearly cost 3 species their planetary mining rights. It began, as these things generally do, with boredom. The Council's quarterly recess week had always been, by long-standing tradition, a quiet affair. Delegates from 31 member species scattered across the orbital station's residential wing with little to do but wait for the next session to begin. Human delegation staff, being human, had solved this problem the way human delegation staff solve most problems involving idle time and a conference room, which was to produce a deck of cards from somewhere nobody quite remembered packing and propose a game. It's called poker, Jake Sutter explained to the small cluster of curious delegates who had wandered over to see what the humans were doing with the strange rectangular objects. You get dealt cards, you bet on how good you think your hand is compared to everyone else's, and the trick is you don't actually have to have a good hand. You just have to convince everyone else that you do. Councillor Vithra Nall, senior delegate for the Dren Compact, tilted her head at this explanation with the particular skepticism her species was known for across every negotiating table in council history. You are describing, she said slowly, a game built entirely around lying convincingly to your opponents. Little bit, yeah, Jake admitted. That seems, Vithra said, like an extraordinarily human thing to have invented. She was not wrong, though it would take the Dren Compact considerably longer than one evening to understand exactly how right she was. The first game was, by all accounts, a modest affair. 6 players, matchstick stakes, nothing that troubled anyone's sense of diplomatic propriety. It was the second game, 3 nights later, when Ambassador Casey Okonkwo joined the table almost as an afterthought, that the Council's collective understanding of human card games began, very quietly, to unravel. Casey Okonkwo had spent 11 years as a labor negotiator before entering the diplomatic corps, a career that had, by her own cheerful admission, taught her considerably more about reading a room than any of her formal council training ever had. And she sat down at that second game with the same relaxed, unbothered expression she wore into every negotiation of her career, an expression that, as several alien delegates would later testify before the full council, gave away, absolutely, nothing whatsoever about what she was actually thinking. This turned out to be the entire problem. Most of the council's member species, evolved across worlds and circumstances wildly different from Earth's own, had never developed anything resembling what human poker players called a poker face, for the simple reason that most of them had never needed one. The Vithra Nall's own species, the Dren, communicated distress and excitement both through a subtle shift in skin pigmentation along their forearms, a trait that had served them beautifully for 11,000 years of open, honest civic life, and served them catastrophically badly the moment they sat down across a card table from a species that had spent its entire evolutionary history learning to hide exactly that kind of information from rivals, predators, and each other. I did not understand the first several hands, Vithra would later testify, with what the transcript recorded as visible discomfort, that my own forearms were informing Ambassador Okonkwo of the exact strength of my hand before I had even finished placing my bet. I believed I was playing a game of chance and strategy. I was, in fact, playing a game in which one participant could read my intentions as easily as reading a printed page, while I remained entirely unable to read hers at all. It was not merely the Dren who suffered this disadvantage. Councillor Bisson Vray, of the small, fiercely proud Austral delegation, discovered, over the course of a single increasingly expensive evening, that his species' involuntary release of a mild anxiety pheromone under stress, a trait that had served Austral society well for generations, by allowing conflicts to be resolved before they ever escalated to open confrontation. Functioned in a human poker game as something uncomfortably close to broadcasting his hand strength directly into the room's ventilation system. The Kethri delegation's representative discovered that his species' habit of humming, almost inaudibly, when genuinely pleased about something, had told Jake Sutter everything he needed to know about the quality of the man's hand 3 separate times before anyone at the table thought to mention it. Humans, meanwhile, sat through hand after hand with expressions that ranged from mild interest to faint boredom regardless of whether they were holding a winning hand or nothing at all, chatting easily about unrelated matters, occasionally even losing hands on purpose in ways that, several delegates would later realize with considerable retrospective horror, had been carefully calculated to build false confidence for exactly the moment it would be most expensive to have it. "I want to be clear," Ambassador Okonkwo told the council, during the formal hearing convened to address what had, by that point, become known across the station as the Tuesday night incident, that nobody on the human delegation set out to exploit anyone. It started as a friendly game. It just turns out that when you put a species that spent 300,000 years learning to bluff at a table with several species that have never once needed to, the game stops being friendly real fast, whether anybody intends it to or not. The Tuesday night incident itself, the event that finally forced the council's hand, began innocently enough 3 weeks after that first modest game, when the stakes had, gradually, thoroughly, and almost without anyone formally deciding it should, escalated well beyond matchsticks. Councillor Vithra Nall, having lost 4 consecutive evenings running and grown, in the particular way of someone determined to win back what pride refused to simply let go of, increasingly reckless in her wagers, found herself, at nearly 2 in the morning station time, staring at a hand she was entirely convinced was unbeatable, across a table from an Ambassador Okonkwo, whose expression had not changed one particle in either direction across the entire evening. "I will wager," Vithra announced, with the particular grand formality her species reserved for moments of significant civic commitment, "the mineral extraction rights to the Dren Compact's 3rd orbital ring for the next standard decade." The table went very quiet. "Counselor," said Bisson-Vray, the Austral delegate, in a voice that even the transcript recorded as strained, "I do not believe you are authorized to wager sovereign mineral rights in a card game." "I am extremely confident in this hand," Vithra said, which the official record would later note was, strictly speaking, not actually a denial of the authorization problem at all. Ambassador Okonkwo, for her part, studied her own cards for a long, thoughtful moment, and then studied Vithra's face for a moment longer, and then, in a gesture that several witnesses would later describe with something approaching reverence, quietly folded her hand and slid her own chips toward the center of the table without wagering the rights back. "I'm not going to take that bet, Counselor," she said. "Not because I think you're bluffing. Honestly, I think you might actually have the best hand at this table right now. I'm folding because there is no version of tonight where the human delegation walks away holding a decade of Dren Compact mineral rights that ends well for anybody, including us. Take your pot. Go home. Get some sleep. This game's gotten a little bigger than a friendly Tuesday night, and I think we all know it." It was, by every account, exactly the right call, and it was also, unfortunately for the long-term future of interspecies poker night, roughly 11 hours too late. News of the wager, authorized or not, had already reached the full council by the following morning, carried with the particular speed that scandalous gossip always seems to travel regardless of species. And by the time the council convened its emergency session, 3 separate delegations had submitted formal reports describing the escalating stakes of what had, by that point, become a semi-regular fixture of station social life. The Kethri delegation reported having wagered, and very nearly lost, a ceremonial artifact considered a sacred object of state. The small Vel delegation reported that their junior attaché had, in a single catastrophic hand 3 days prior, come within a single card of betting away his own diplomatic credentials, a wager the human players at the table had, to their considerable credit, unanimously and immediately refused to accept before it could be formally placed. The pattern that emerges from these reports, said Council Chair Elsa Korath, addressing the full assembly with the weary patience of someone who had genuinely not expected her tenure as chair to include a scandal involving card games, is not one of malicious exploitation on the part of the human delegation. Every account submitted to this body confirms that human players consistently declined wagers that exceeded reasonable stakes, on multiple occasions actively refusing bets that other delegations attempted to place. The pattern that emerges instead is considerably stranger and considerably more difficult to legislate against. It appears that human biology and human social conditioning combine to produce a species that is, without any particular effort or malice, simply extraordinarily good at a game the rest of this council has no meaningful defense against. Ambassador Okonkwo, called before the full council to explain what Chair Korath's report delicately termed the human competitive advantage, did her best to make the case honestly. "I don't think this is really about cheating," she told the assembled delegations. "Nobody's marking cards or hiding aces up a sleeve. It's simpler than that, and honestly a little sadder if you think about it long enough. Humans evolved in social groups where hiding what you're really thinking, at least sometimes, was a survival skill. We negotiated with rival tribes who'd have exploited any honest weakness we showed them. We played diplomacy with in-laws and enemies, and everybody in between for about as long as we've had language at all. Bluffing isn't a trick we learned. It's closer to a language we've been speaking so long we don't even notice we're fluent in it anymore. Most of your species didn't need to develop that, because your own biology already handles conflict resolution more honestly, more directly, in ways that have clearly worked out great for you in every other part of civilized life. It's just a genuinely bad matchup, is what it is, when you put a species that never learned to hide its feelings at a table specifically designed to reward hiding them. That's not a flaw in your delegations, counselors. If anything, I think it says something better about most of you than it says about us." Councillor Vithra Nall, still faintly, visibly embarrassed about the events of the Tuesday night incident, raised a question that the transcript records as drawing quiet, sympathetic laughter from several delegations around the chamber. "Is there truly no way for another species to learn this skill?" she asked. "It seems, having lost considerably more than I intended to over these past several weeks, that I would very much like the opportunity to eventually win some of it back." "Counselor, with respect," Ambassador Okonkwo said, not unkindly, "you'd need about 300,000 years of evolutionary head start, and I don't think this council's got that kind of patience in its current session schedule." The final ruling, adopted unanimously later that same session, banned human participation in wagered card games at official council functions, a decision the human delegation itself, somewhat to the surprise of several other delegates, voted in favor of without any visible reluctance at all. "Honestly," Jake Sutter said afterward, packing away the deck of cards that had, in the space of a single recess week, very nearly triggered an interstellar mineral rights crisis, "I think it's the right call. It wasn't fun for us either after a certain point. Watching people bet things they clearly shouldn't be betting because they were sure, absolutely sure, that this was finally the hand where they'd win it back. That's not really a fun game anymore. That's just watching somebody dig a hole." The ban held, formally, for the better part of 2 years, enforced with the particular thoroughness the council reserved for rules born of genuine institutional embarrassment. It was Councillor Vithra Nall, of all delegates, who eventually petitioned to have it lifted, under considerably more careful conditions than the original Tuesday night game had ever bothered establishing. "I have spent 2 years studying the game," she told the council, presenting her petition with the same grand formality she had once used to wager away a decade of mineral rights. Not simply the rules, the psychology beneath them. Human negotiation theory, human behavioral literature, several dozen recorded matches which the human delegation was, I should note, quite generous in providing for study purposes. I do not believe I can match a human's instinct for deception. That instinct took 300,000 years to develop, and I have had 2. But I believe I have learned enough to at least lose more slowly, and with somewhat more dignity, and I would like the opportunity to test that theory. Under strict stake limits this council can actually enforce. The council granted the petition, with conditions, and the resulting game, held 11 months later in a conference room considerably more crowded with observers than any poker game in council history had previously attracted, ended with Vithra Nall losing, gracefully, by a narrower margin than anyone, including Vithra herself, had genuinely expected. Better, Ambassador Okonkwo told her afterward, shaking her hand across the table with what the observing delegates universally described as real, unguarded respect. Not good enough to beat me yet, but better. Give it another decade or two and I think you might actually have a shot. 2 years to lose only somewhat catastrophically, Vithra said, with the dry, hard-won humor of someone who had clearly grown considerably since the events of the original Tuesday night incident. I suppose, against a species with your particular head start, that counts as a genuine victory. Counselor, Ambassador Okonkwo said, gathering up the cards with a smile that, for once, gave away exactly what she was thinking. Around this table, I think it absolutely does.